Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that the river your entire country depends on is now controlled by another nation. For Egypt, that nightmare may already be beginning. Upstream in Ethiopia, a massive new dam now holds back a reservoir so large it could reshape the flow of the Nile itself. Two ancient civilizations now face a dangerous question. Who controls the river that decides whether millions live or suffer thirst? For thousands of years, one river has decided whether civilizations rise or collapse in Northeast Africa. The Nile. From space, the Nile appears like a thin green thread cutting through one of the harshest deserts on Earth. Without it, Egypt would simply be another stretch of sand. But with it, Egypt became one of the most powerful civilizations in human history. For centuries, control of the Nile meant control of life itself. Today, that ancient reality has returned in a new and dangerous form. Two nations now stand at the center of a geopolitical collision that could reshape Africa's future. Egypt, the downstream nation that depends almost entirely on the Nile for survival, and Ethiopia, the upstream power that has just completed the largest hydroelectric dam ever built on the African continent, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, a structure so massive it can hold more water than the entire annual flow of the Blue Nile. To Ethiopia, the dam represents national revival. To Egypt, it represents a potential existential threat. Because when water becomes scarce, diplomacy becomes fragile. And history has shown that nations rarely negotiate calmly when survival is at stake. The countdown to midnight. At sunrise, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam stands like a wall of concrete across the Blue Nile. Satellite images show its enormous reservoir stretching across the Ethiopian highlands. The scale is staggering. The dam rises more than 145 meters high and stretches nearly 2 kilometers across the river valley. Behind it lies a reservoir capable of holding approximately 74 billion cubic meters of water. To put that into perspective, that volume is roughly equal to the entire annual flow of the Blue Nile. This single structure now has the ability to regulate the most important river system in Northeast Africa. For Ethiopia, this project represents decades of ambition. For Egypt, it represents a terrifying uncertainty, because more than 110 million Egyptians depend almost entirely on the Nile for their water supply. Approximately 90% of Egypt's fresh water comes from this river. Agriculture, drinking water, industry, energy, every aspect of Egyptian life flows from the Nile. The country receives almost no rainfall. Without the river, Egypt simply cannot survive. And that reality is what makes this conflict so dangerous. When a nation believes its survival is threatened, compromise becomes much harder. The geography of power. To understand this crisis, we must first understand how the Nile actually works. The Nile is not a single river, it is a network. Two major tributaries feed the river that ultimately flows through Sudan and Egypt. The White Nile originates in the Great Lakes region of East Africa. It flows slowly through Uganda and South Sudan before reaching Sudan. But the White Nile contributes only a portion of the Nile's total water. The Ethiopian highlands at Lake Tana. During the rainy season, enormous volumes of water pour down from these mountains. This tributary provides roughly 85% of the Nile's total water flow, which means that Ethiopia, not Egypt, controls the primary source of the river. For most of history, this geographical fact remained politically irrelevant. Why? Because Ethiopia lacked the infrastructure to control the river's flow. But the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam has changed that reality. For the first time in history, Ethiopia now possesses the physical ability to regulate the water that ultimately reaches Egypt. And that single change has transformed the geopolitics of the entire region. The ancient relationship between Egypt and the Nile. To Egyptians, the Nile is not simply a river, it is the foundation of their civilization. Ancient Egyptian society was built around the predictable flooding of the Nile. Without them, agriculture would have been impossible. Ancient Egyptians even worshipped the river as a divine force. The Nile god Hapi symbolized fertility and abundance. Every flood was celebrated as a blessing. But modern engineering changed that ancient rhythm. In the 20th century, Egypt built one of the largest dams in the world, the Aswan High Dam. Completed in the 1970s, this project allowed Egypt to regulate the river's seasonal floods. It created Lake Nasser, a vast reservoir stretching across southern Egypt. The dam provided electricity, it stabilized irrigation, but it also reinforced Egypt's belief that the Nile was fundamentally its resource. For decades, Egypt viewed control of the river as a matter of national security, and this belief shaped the treaties and agreements that governed the Nile basin. Colonial treaties and the question of ownership. In the early 20th century, the Nile basin was dominated by European colonial powers. A series of agreements were created that effectively granted Egypt control over the Nile's waters. The most significant agreement came in 1929. This treaty gave Egypt veto power over upstream projects that might affect the river's flow. Later, a 1959 agreement between Egypt and Sudan further reinforced this system. The treaty divided the Nile's water between the two countries. Egypt received the majority share. Sudan received the remainder. But the most important detail was what the treaty did not include. It did not include Ethiopia. Despite being the primary source of the Blue Nile, Ethiopia was excluded from these agreements. From Ethiopia's perspective, this arrangement was deeply unfair. It meant that a country providing most of the water had no legal claim to use it. For decades, Ethiopia lacked the economic and technical capacity to challenge this system. But as Ethiopia's economy began to grow in the early 21st century, its leaders began to reconsider this historical imbalance. For decades, Ethiopia has faced severe energy shortages. Despite having one of the largest populations in Africa, large parts of the country lacked reliable electricity. Hydroelectric power offered a solution. The Ethiopian highlands receive heavy seasonal rainfall. Their steep terrain is ideal for hydroelectric dams. Engineers realized that a large dam on the Blue Nile could generate enormous amounts of electricity. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is designed to produce more than 6,000 megawatts of power. That is enough to transform Ethiopia into one of Africa's largest energy exporters. Electricity from the dam could power factories, cities, and new industries. It could also be exported to neighboring countries. For Ethiopia, this project represents economic transformation. But for Egypt, the same project represents something entirely different, a potential loss of control over the. Because the country has almost no alternative water sources. Climate change is already increasing pressure on the region's water supply. Population growth continues to increase demand, and agricultural systems depend heavily on Nile irrigation. Any significant reduction in water flow could have devastating consequences. Crop failures, food shortages, economic instability, migration pressures. Egyptian officials have therefore warned that any threat to their water supply could trigger severe responses. At various points during negotiations, Egyptian leaders have suggested that all options remain on the table. This phrase carries heavy implications because it includes the possibility of military action. The filling of the reservoir. The most sensitive issue in the Nile dispute is not the dam itself. It is how the reservoir is filled. When a large dam is first built, the reservoir must be gradually filled with water. This process can take several years. During this period, water that would normally flow downstream is temporarily held behind the dam. For Egypt, this is the most dangerous phase. If the filling happens too quickly, it could significantly reduce water availability downstream. Egyptian agriculture depends on predictable Nile flows. Even small reductions could affect irrigation systems across the Nile Delta. This is why negotiations have focused heavily on the timeline for filling the reservoir. Ethiopia argues that it must fill the dam quickly enough to begin generating electricity. Egypt argues that filling must happen slowly enough to prevent water shortages. This disagreement has become the core of the diplomatic crisis. Because once the reservoir reaches full capacity, Ethiopia will control a powerful new lever in regional politics. As negotiations have stalled over the years, tensions between Egypt and Ethiopia have occasionally escalated. Both nations have powerful reasons to defend their positions. Egypt has one of the largest and most capable militaries in Africa. Its armed forces have long considered the Nile a strategic asset. Egyptian leaders have repeatedly stated that the country will defend its water rights if necessary. At various points during the dispute, military analysts have speculated about the possibility of an Egyptian strike on the dam, but such an operation would be extremely difficult. The dam lies deep inside Ethiopian territory, hundreds of kilometers from Egypt's borders. Airstrikes would require long-range operations and cooperation from neighboring countries. And even if such an attack were successful, it could trigger catastrophic consequences. Destroying the dam would unleash billions of cubic meters of water downstream. Sudan, located directly between Ethiopia and Egypt, but the mere possibility of conflict adds pressure to already fragile negotiations. Diplomatic deadlock. Over the past decade, multiple rounds of negotiations have attempted to resolve the Nile dispute. Talks have involved mediators from the African Union, observers from the United States and European Union, technical experts from international water organizations. Despite these efforts, a comprehensive agreement has remained elusive. The main sticking points include the speed of reservoir filling, rules for releasing water during droughts, mechanisms for dispute resolution. Egypt wants legally binding guarantees that protect its water supply. Ethiopia prefers flexible guidelines that allow it to manage the dam according to its own needs. These positions reflect deeper historical tensions. Egypt's leadership has long viewed the Nile as a strategic entitlement. Ethiopia views the river as a natural resource that should benefit all countries in the basin. Beyond water itself, the dam introduces a new economic dynamic in the region. Electricity generated by the dam could transform Ethiopia into a regional energy hub. Neighboring countries such as Sudan, Kenya, and Djibouti could purchase electricity from Ethiopia's grid. This would create new economic relationships within East Africa. Energy exports could generate billions of dollars in revenue for Ethiopia. At the same time, improved energy access could accelerate industrial development across the region. This potential economic transformation adds another layer to the conflict. Because the dam is not only about water, it is about power in multiple senses of the word. Electrical power, economic power, and geopolitical influence. Paths toward cooperation. Despite the tensions, many experts believe that cooperative solutions remain possible. One potential path involves coordinated water management across the entire basin. Under such arrangements, upstream dams could regulate flows in ways that benefit downstream agriculture. Shared data systems could help predict droughts and floods. Joint infrastructure projects could improve irrigation efficiency. Another possibility involves energy cooperation. If Ethiopia exports electricity generated by the dam to Egypt and Sudan, it could create mutual economic incentives for stability. Some proposals have even suggested financial compensation mechanisms tied to water releases during drought periods. Such arrangements would require unprecedented levels of trust, but they demonstrate that conflict is not the only possible outcome.